Welcome to the fourth week of Season September. Today we're going to talk about the Akron rubber strikes of 1936 and a type of strike that quite literally seizes the means of production, even if only temporarily. But first, let's briefly talk about the recent history of rubber and the rubber industry. In 1839, Charles Goodyear invented the process of vulcanization, which made rubber more durable and resistant to high and low temperatures than earlier non-vulcanized rubber. The vulcanization process became extremely important as Europeans invented new ways of getting around, first the bicycle, and not too long after, the automobile. As these modes of transportation became more popular in the late 19th and early 20th century, the need for rubber tires skyrocketed. Rubber was originally procured from Landolphia vines in Brazil and Central Africa, but the English wanted so much of the stuff that they created rubber plantations in Sri Lanka and Singapore. Rubber tires were also in high demand in the United States, where motor cars such as the Ford Model T and Chevrolet Series AC International roared up and down the streets. I want to quickly note here that tires were only one part of the rubber industry in America, the other part being the smaller, more decentralized industry that employed nearly as many women as it did men to manufacture belt fans, rubber shoe soles, golf balls, which were made of rubber back then, rubbers, galoshes, and rubbers, like condoms. You can expect a video about that in the future. The tire industry, however, was seemingly heavily centralized in the city of Akron, Ohio. The city where LeBron James was born. How centralized? In 1935, 2/3 of all tires made in the United States were made in Akron, Ohio. 5 companies, Goodyear Tire and Rubber, Firestone, B.F. Goodrich, General Tire, and U.S. Rubber, produced 96% of U.S.-made tires. Goodyear alone had 30% of market share and as many as 16,000 workers in Akron, many of whom were tire builders or pit workers working 6-hour days, 6 days a week. The manual labor associated with building tires, especially those of trucks, was so exhausting that 6 hours was all they could take. Because Goodyear was by far the largest tire company, its conditions and wages set the standard for the rest of the industry. What's important to know here is that the decision for a 6-hour day came from Paul Litchfield in 1931, who was CEO of Goodyear and had founded the Goodyear Industrial Assembly in 1919. Right, so the Goodyear Industrial Assembly was a company union. According to some sources, it was the first American company union. A company union is a union that is controlled or at least highly influenced by an employer. In other words, it's not really a union and more of a way for employers to give workers the illusion of representation. Anyway, this union was headed by delegates who weren't really organizers since they towed the company line, but filled with Goodyear employees who were actually concerned about worker grievances. This was the height of organized labor in Akron rubber companies until the passage of the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933. Most notably, Title I, Section 7A of this act, which stated that employees shall have the right to organize and bargain collectively through representatives of their own choosing, and which banned yellow dog contracts. Yellow dog contracts are contracts between an employee and an employer where the worker agrees not to join a union under condition of employment. The NIRA inspired thousands of Akron rubber workers to band together and form their own locals, while the American Federation of Labor formed a national rubber association known as the Federal Rubber Workers Union. By the end of 1933, 85% of Akron rubber workers were in this union. Tire companies, however, refused to recognize or negotiate with local unions. The Federal Rubber Workers Union needed to find a path to gain union recognition, but there was a difference in opinion between organizers in the AFL and workers in the local unions on how to achieve this. The AFL leadership's approach was to divide workers into individual craft unions and to negotiate collective bargaining contracts with tire companies, while the rank and file wanted to strike until companies recognized their unions. The AFL frequently tried to dissuade workers from organizing a strike, but the rank and file members remained persistent. The AFL finally agreed to hold a strike vote after repeated pressure from local unions at Firestone, Goodrich, and Goodyear in March of 1935. But just 2 days before the vote, Bill Green, president of the AFL, organized a meeting in D.C. with rubber company officials, the Department of Labor, and the leadership of the AFL. The workers were promised by Coleman Clarity, an AFL organizer, that they would be consulted before a final decision was made, but when Clarity returned 3 days later, he informed rubber workers that an agreement had been reached. The terms of the agreement did not satisfy the workers, who still voted in favor of the agreement, but began to leave the AFL en masse, feeling that the organization was in the pockets of the bosses. Rubber workers began to organize a rubber workers convention and a new union that would not be led by the AFL. On September 12, 1935, in Akron, Ohio, the convention was held and the United Rubber Workers International Union was founded, with Sherman Dalrymple elected as the first president. Clarity, who the AFL wanted as president of the URW, announced that the AFL would not support the new union. But it didn't matter. The rubber workers now had a union they could trust. However, the local union of the General Tire and Rubber Company took a much more radical approach to opposing both their employer and the AFL. Instead of listening to the AFL, they planned and possibly rehearsed a new type of strike that had never taken place in the country before. On June 19, 1934, General Tire local president Rex Murray walked throughout the worksite, giving workers the signal to stop working. But instead of walking out, the workers remained at their stations and the factory shut down. This was a sit-down strike. For the next 18 hours, the workers occupied their workstations until they decided to walk out and have a conventional strike that lasted into July. The strike succeeded in getting General Tire to sign an informal bargaining contract and recognize the union. The final major event we need to discuss occurred in October of 1935. The Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company announced that it would extend the workday to 8 hours for its workers beginning New Year's Day. This was big for a couple of reasons. First, the lengthening of the workday meant that workers would be even more exhausted from their physically demanding shifts. Next, Goodyear would only need enough staff for 3 shifts rather than 4, resulting in hundreds of workers getting laid off. And finally, because Goodyear was the largest company by market share, the other rubber companies in Akron would surely follow suit and implement the 8-hour day in their factories as well. Thousands of rubber jobs were on the line because of this one decision. That same day, the still small local URW-2 began organizing to fight the decision. They protested outside Goodyear facilities, began a campaign to get as many workers to join as possible, and wrote to the Department of Labor. Meanwhile, the Goodyear Industrial Assembly voted against the 8-hour day, hoping this would have an effect. Litchfield, however, refused to accept the vote and ignored the Industrial Assembly. In the following months, Goodyear planned to transition to the 8-hour day while laying off workers they would no longer need until New Year's Day, when the entire company would be converted to the new time. From what I can tell, the 8-hour day was not implemented in the tire building and pit departments. On January 6th, a fact-finding committee appointed by Secretary of Labor Francis Perkins came out against the 8-hour day, the way it was implemented, and Goodyear for not recognizing the URW. In the meantime, hundreds of Goodyear employees began to leave the Industrial Assembly, with some of them joining the URW and finally bringing us to the strikes. As you can tell from the title of the video, there wasn't just one sit-down strike. Over the course of 1936 alone, there were hundreds of sit-down strikes, and while I could talk about several of them, I'm only going to talk about the main ones in the first half of 1936 in detail. Don't worry though, we'll come back to this topic again in the future. I'm also not going to talk about the Communist Party of America and their role here, because that is its own video. In January of 1936, Firestone sent a company man to spy on the union members, especially URW committee man Clay Dix. At some point, Dix and the spy got into an argument and decided to settle it after work. Dix laid him out. Like, it was better than that time a union guy socked Crowder, so Firestone responded by suspending him for a week without pay. The men were upset by this, but they were mainly irritated by the recent reduction in base pay rate and the impending 8-hour day. On January 29th, they decided to strike without even consulting their local officials. At 2 a.m., the truck tire department stopped operating their machines and initiated the sit-down. The strike quickly spread to workers in the auto tire department, and before long the entire shift halted work. This action continued into the next shift, and the next shift, and the shift after, until all shifts participated and a second plant planned their own sit-down strike. Firestone, fearing that the sit-down would blossom into a traditional strike for recognition of the URW, chose to settle after around 48 hours. Talks with local URW-7 leaders and Firestone at first failed to reach an agreement, but union leader Dalrymple intervened and led the negotiations for the local union. In the end, they agreed to negotiate the base pay rate, 3 hours of pay for every day lost during the strike, and the reinstatement of Dix with payment from the company spy. On January 31st, non-union Goodyear employees decided to hold their own sit-down to protest reduction in the piece rate. While initially ignored by Goodyear management and unsupported by URW Local 2, the resulting support from members in bad standing and new members led the local leaders to support the action. Work resumed when a Goodyear manager threatened to fire the workers and the strike failed. On February 8th and 9th, Goodrich employees sat down against their cut in wages. Goodrich settled, fearing that an extended strike would take place and workers would demand union recognition. Workers even tried to hold out for compensation for the days they were on strike, but Dalrymple had to convince them that wouldn't work. On Valentine's Day, a foreman notified many workers at 2 a.m. that they were being furloughed. Many of these workers had been recalled the previous year and were low seniority. Just like the workers at other plants, they were irritated by the impending 8-hour day. The foreman, confronted by the men, told them to speak with the shift foreman. 3 committeemen organized and tried to negotiate with the shift foreman, but he was of no help. When asked to leave, the men refused and sat in well into the afternoon. That evening, they were locked in the plant and informed that they had been fired. When the workers left the plant the next day, URW Local 2 offered their services in hall for negotiations. On February 15th, Goodyear agreed to reinstate the 137 strikers, but were unwilling to reinstate the 70 men who had been laid off, reverse the wage cuts, or the much-hated 8-hour day. On February 17th, the Beacon Journal reported that Goodyear had made a profit of $5.4 million in 1935, up from $4.5 million in 1934. That same day, the URW held a rally for the workers of the Goodyear plant, where workers gave heated speeches before voting in favor of a sit-down strike that evening, without even notifying Goodyear. The greatest of the Akron rubber strikes was on. At this point, the URW had only 600 members, or perhaps 5% of the workers at the plant. In fact, many of the workers who had voted weren't even in the union. But the URW leadership, seeing that the strike was on no matter what, decided to support the strikers. One striker volunteered to be strike captain and was accepted by Local 2 committee for the position because he was a well-respected member of the community. Over the course of the strike, several important supporting roles and structures were created. One of the first things the strikers did was build small shanties next to the 160 gates of the Goodyear plants, along with ash cans to keep the strikers warm. Men picketing at the gates were fed by lunch trucks, providing sandwiches and hot meals. This was crucial because at times the temperature reached 13 below zero and a few blizzards occurred. All Akron unions affiliated with the Central Labor Union voted unanimously to support the strike, even later voting to call a general strike if the police or National Guard were sent to break the strike. They helped Goodyear employees by supporting picket lines and raising money for food and supplies. The WPA unions played a large role in getting community support and helping run a union soup kitchen. The recently formed CIO supported the strikers with experienced organizers while establishing a defense committee to fight a company injunction and handle other legal disputes. URW workers even got their own radio time on WJW. And both Akron anti-strike papers published neutral articles with comments from both Goodyear and the strikers. Litchfield and Goodyear refused to negotiate, claiming that most of the workers were in fact loyal and that 600 workers were preventing them from toiling happily. With the Goodyear Industrial Assembly effectively dead, Litchfield created a new posse of Goodyear bootlicks, who went to Mayor Shroy asking them to break the strike. Next, Litchfield spent over $15,000 to arm a private army with firearms and gas bombs. The mayor and Sheriff Flowers supported Goodyear but did not want to attack the strike, fearing that they wouldn't be re-elected in the future. Sheriff Flower was already on thin ice for using gas bombs during a raid in the Barberton insulator strike, which included women and children. Litchfield, unable to get the local government to kick out the strikers, wrote to Ohio Governor Martin L. Davey to get him to send in the National Guard. Davey refused, stating that the dispute was a local one. Litchfield did all of this in just the first 3 days. On the 4th day, Goodyear decided to get a court injunction banning picketing at Goodyear plants, which would legally require the police to break the strike. The Akron judges, despite fearing how the public might respond, signed an injunction banning picketing at Goodyear plants. It was only then did the mayor send in the police. The first time the police attempted to break the strike, the strikers and supporting workers from Goodrich, Firestone, and the WPA, armed with clubs, pipes, and bits of rubber, beat up the cops. The second time the mayor tried to send in the cops, they refused. Litchfield then devised a new plan: get the public to turn against the strikers. In the papers and on radio WADC, Litchfield spread rumors that the strikers were being led by communists and spies. On the 9th day, the Assistant Secretary of Labor and former AFL organizer Ed McGrady went to Akron to help both parties negotiate. However, according to Communist Party organizer Jim Keller, McGrady was well known for getting workers back to work without a contract and prolonging negotiations for months, until worker support ran out of steam. McGrady attempted to help both parties negotiate twice, but ultimately the strikers drove him out. With growing pressure from the other companies and industries on Litchfield's shoulders, on the 20th day he and the URW held a secret meeting to negotiate. 3 days later, the press announced that Goodyear and the URW had a proposed settlement, when in reality they didn't. Litchfield told the papers that there was a settlement to make it appear that Goodyear was trying to end the strike peacefully to gain public support. In reality, he was preparing his personal army known as the Akron Law and Order League, an organization filled with anti-union townspeople and headed by former Akron Mayor Nelson Sparks. Left with no choice, the workers voted on the proposals. They voted in favor of the proposals they agreed with, while voting down and amending the ones they did not like. When the URW negotiators attempted to negotiate once more, the company claimed the union rejected all proposals outright and sent in the Law and Order League of allegedly 5,200. The picket line was able to hold off the league long enough for a second set of proposals to come from Goodyear. The exhausted strikers voted in favor of the proposals, ending the strike after 33 days on March 21st. The strikers were largely victorious, winning 6-hour shifts and 36-hour work weeks in the tire departments, advanced layoff notices, management would deal with employees through selected representatives, prior notice for wage changes, and all employees as of February 12th would get their jobs back. Goodyear, however, still refused to recognize the union. It was less than the union wanted, but a victory for the URW no less. As John House put it, after the strike, instead of a weak 500 or 600 member union, we had more than 10,000 members. Between the end of this strike and 1937, hundreds more sit-down strikes were organized, most lasting 1 or 2 days over various issues including some petty ones. Often, when one sit-down occurred, sit-downs would break out at other plants, and these strikes occurred for reasons including the hiring of non-union workers, wages, layoffs, and workers not adhering to production limitations. Union negotiators sometimes struggled as workers gave no reason for the strike. A lot of the strikes began late at night, as these workers were the most vulnerable to layoffs. These workers tended to be younger and less likely to have major financial commitments like mortgages. They were also more likely to get caught up in the moment rather than planning for long-term strikes and goals. In the end, the URW did get recognition from major rubber companies and would formally negotiate contracts for Firestone in 1937, B.F. Goodrich in 1938, and Goodyear in 1941. So, why were the early sit-down strikes so successful? First and foremost, striking inside the plant had its advantages because the workers were sitting on the means of production, quite literally. During sit-down strikes, workers did not destroy the machinery, and typically these demonstrations were non-violent. Workers would even finish any undone work that might ruin the tires, as to not cause any unnecessary damage. Scabs are unable to work, meaning that the company can't produce products for consumers or make revenue. Employers typically did not send in the police because violently breaking the strike risked damage to the machinery or a negative perception from the public. The police can't blame strikers for instigating violence if they rush into the factory. I've even seen the claim that of 1,000 sit-downs reported by the press in 1936 and 1937, only 25 were broken by the police. As we saw with the Goodyear strike, other unions committing to manning the picket lines and helping feed workers allowed the strike to last significantly longer than the other sit-down strikes. Anytime anti-strikers attempted to break the strike, the massive amounts of supporters were able to defeat the opposing force. Though for many of the later, shorter strikes, waiting out the strike tended to be the best tactic for companies, since the public would pressure the strikers to come to an agreement with management so plants would not be idle for long. Employers typically did not cut power to the factory and still had janitors and cafeteria staff serve the facility, though, as we'll see in the future, employers later took drastic steps in breaking sit-down strikes. So that raises the question, why aren't we doing sit-down strikes if they are so effective? Well, long story short, they're illegal, but I'll talk about that more in the future. I would like to thank ELO for the amazing title card. This title card really gives me a warm, fuzzy feeling. This month, I've been trying to organize my warehouse, and this drawing reminds me of one of the first meetings I had with a couple of my coworkers. Links to their social media below. Thanks for watching, and sorry for the long runtime. This video was only supposed to be 15 minutes long, but y'all know how I am. Anyway, please like, subscribe, and share with your friends if you learned something. While this was originally the last Seize the Mean September video, I've decided I think I'll make a bonus one. And sticking with the theme, I think we're gonna do another sit-down strike. See you then.